The darkness was absolute. No moon, heavy cloud cover, and the kind of tropical night where the ocean and sky merged into a single black void. It was November 7th, 1942, and Rear Admiral Hiroaki Abe stood on the bridge of the battleship Hiei, leading a Japanese naval force through the waters north of Guadalcanal. His mission was straightforward: bombard Henderson Field, destroy the American aircraft based there, and support Japanese ground forces struggling to retake the island. Abe had every reason to feel confident. His force included 2 battleships, a light cruiser, and 14 destroyers. More importantly, he possessed something the Americans supposedly lacked: years of intensive training in night combat operations. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent the better part of a decade perfecting tactics for fighting in darkness. They'd developed superior optics, trained lookouts to spot targets at extraordinary distances, and refined coordination techniques that allowed their ships to maneuver and fight effectively when most navies were essentially blind. Night combat was a Japanese specialty, perhaps their greatest tactical advantage in the surface war. And on this particular night, with visibility near zero, that advantage should have been overwhelming. Then, at approximately 1:24 in the morning, something impossible happened. American destroyers turned directly toward Abe's force and increased speed to attack, even though there was no way they could have seen the Japanese ships. No visual contact was possible at that range in those conditions. Yet, the Americans maneuvered with precision, as if they could see perfectly in the pitch darkness. Within minutes, the Battle of Guadalcanal had erupted into a chaotic close-range brawl that would leave both sides bloodied. But for Admiral Abe and the officers around him, the most disturbing aspect wasn't the violence of the engagement. It was the growing realization that the Americans had known exactly where the Japanese fleet was, long before visual contact should have been possible. They'd detected Abe's force, tracked its movements, and positioned their ships for attack, all in complete darkness. The Americans, it seemed, had found a way to see in the dark. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Imperial Japanese Navy entered World War II with arguably the best trained naval personnel in the world, particularly for night surface combat. This wasn't accident or propaganda. It was the result of systematic training that began in the 1920s and intensified throughout the 1930s. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized aggressive night attacks, using darkness as both concealment and weapon. The reasoning was sound. Japan couldn't match the combined industrial output of potential enemies like the United States or Britain, so Japanese planners sought qualitative advantages that would offset quantitative disadvantages. Night combat training became one of those force multipliers. Japanese lookouts underwent exhaustive programs designed to maximize their natural night vision. They spent hours in darkened rooms, practicing target identification with minimal light. They learned to use peripheral vision, which is more sensitive to low light than direct viewing. They developed techniques for quickly scanning sectors of the horizon, looking for subtle changes in the darkness that might indicate an enemy ship. The training was so intensive that elite lookouts could reportedly spot a ship's wake or the faint glow of a smokestack at distances exceeding 10 miles under ideal conditions. Beyond human vision, the Japanese invested heavily in optical equipment. Their night binoculars were among the finest in the world, with large objective lenses that gathered maximum available light. Some Japanese ships carried specialized optical rangefinders with magnification that allowed relatively precise distance measurements, even in low light. Fire control directors incorporated optics designed specifically for night engagement. The emphasis on optical superiority wasn't just about having better equipment. It was about creating an integrated system where superior vision translated directly into tactical advantage. Japanese naval tactics for night combat were equally sophisticated. Ships practiced maintaining formation in complete darkness, using minimal light signals that wouldn't reveal their position to enemies. They developed doctrine for coordinated torpedo attacks, with destroyers racing in at high speed to launch their deadly Type 93 long-lance torpedoes, before enemy ships could react. The long lance itself was a technological marvel, oxygen-fueled rather than using compressed air, which eliminated the telltale wake of bubbles that could reveal a torpedo's approach. With a range exceeding 20 miles and a warhead containing over 1,000 pounds of explosive, a single long lance hit could cripple or sink most warships. The psychological dimension of night combat played into Japanese hands as well. Fighting in darkness was inherently terrifying, requiring iron discipline and extensive training to maintain formation and execute coordinated maneuvers when you couldn't see your own ships, let alone the enemy. The Japanese believed, with considerable justification, that their crews were better prepared mentally and technically for this kind of warfare than any potential opponent. Early war results seem to validate this confidence. At the Battle of the Java Sea in February 1942, Japanese forces decimated an Allied cruiser force in a night engagement. At Savo Island in August 1942, Japanese cruisers surprised and destroyed 4 Allied heavy cruisers in perhaps the worst defeat the United States Navy ever suffered at sea. These victories reinforced the Japanese conviction that night combat was their domain, an area where American numerical and industrial advantages didn't matter because the Americans simply couldn't fight effectively in darkness. Japanese naval officers studied these battles carefully, refining their tactics and growing increasingly confident that nighttime surface actions would consistently favor them. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't have understood from their victories, was that American technology was evolving in ways that would make traditional night combat tactics completely obsolete. The American solution wasn't better optics or more intensive training. It was a technology that most Japanese naval officers barely understood, and many didn't believe actually worked. Radar. Radar, an acronym for radio detection and ranging, operates on principles that seem almost magical if you don't understand the physics. A transmitter sends out pulses of radio waves. When those waves encounter an object, they reflect back. A receiver detects the reflected waves, and by measuring the time delay between transmission and reception, the system calculates the distance to the object. By measuring the direction from which the reflection returns, it determines the object's bearing. The result is the ability to detect ships, aircraft, even land masses, at distances far beyond visual range and in conditions where human vision is completely useless. The technology had been developing throughout the 1930s in several countries simultaneously. Britain led in practical application, driven by the desperate need to detect German bombers before they reached English cities. The United States followed closely, with the Navy recognizing radar's potential for naval warfare early on. By 1942, American destroyers and cruisers were being equipped with increasingly sophisticated radar sets that could detect surface ships at ranges that seemed impossible to officers trained in optical warfare. The SG Surface Search Radar, which began appearing on American ships in 1942, could detect large ships at ranges exceeding 20 miles under good conditions. Even in poor weather, with rain squalls and low visibility that completely defeated optical range-finding, radar continued working. For the Japanese, radar represented a fundamental challenge to their entire naval philosophy. Japanese scientists understood the basic principles, and Japan had begun radar development programs in the late 1930s. But these programs suffered from lower priority, limited resources, and a cultural tendency within the military to prioritize offensive weapons over defensive technologies. Japanese radar development lagged years behind American and British efforts. More critically, even the radar sets Japan did produce were often unreliable, short-ranged, and installed on too few ships to matter tactically. The few Japanese naval officers who understood radar's potential tried to warn their superiors about the implications. If the Americans could detect Japanese ships before the Japanese could see American ships, then all of Japan's advantages in night combat optics and training became irrelevant. You couldn't use superior binoculars to spot an enemy who already knew exactly where you were and had positioned his guns accordingly. But these warnings struggled against institutional inertia and the intoxicating evidence of early victories. Why worry about a technology that seemed theoretical when traditional methods were working perfectly? The night battles of 1942 would provide a brutal education. Japanese confidence in night combat supremacy was about to collide with American technological capabilities, and that collision would force a complete reassessment of how naval warfare worked in the dark. Admiral Abe's force on that November night represented the Japanese Navy at its most confident. They were steaming into waters they'd controlled for months, executing a mission type they'd practiced extensively, using tactics they'd refined through actual combat. The Americans they expected to encounter were garrison forces, probably dispersed and certainly unaware of the approaching Japanese fleet until it was too late. The plan called for Abe's battleships to approach Guadalcanal, use their massive 14-inch guns to obliterate Henderson Field and its aircraft, then withdraw before American aircraft could retaliate at dawn. It was a proven method. Japanese battleships had successfully shelled Henderson Field before, disrupting American air operations and supporting Japanese ground forces. What Abe didn't know was that the American force commander, Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan, had been tracking the Japanese fleet for hours using radar. The Americans knew the Japanese were coming, knew their approximate composition and course, and had positioned their cruisers and destroyers to intercept. When the battle erupted at close range, it did so because Callahan had deliberately closed the distance, not because he'd stumbled blindly into a superior force. The engagement itself was a confused melee that demonstrated both the power and limitations of early radar technology. American ships had detected the Japanese fleet, but coordinating an attack based on radar contacts while maintaining formation in darkness proved extraordinarily difficult. Ships fired on radar contacts they couldn't visually confirm, sometimes hitting friendly vessels by mistake. The Japanese, once they realized they were under attack, fought with their customary ferocity and skill. The battle raged for less than an hour, but it was among the most violent naval engagements of the war. When it ended, both sides had taken terrible losses. The Americans lost 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers, including Callahan's flagship, with Callahan himself killed in action. The Japanese lost 2 destroyers and, critically, the battleship Hiei, which was crippled during the night action and sunk by American aircraft the following day. From a pure casualty standpoint, the engagement could be called a draw or even a Japanese tactical victory. But strategically, the Americans had accomplished their objective. They'd prevented the bombardment of Henderson Field, and they'd done it by detecting and engaging a Japanese force in conditions that should have given the Japanese every advantage. The post-battle reports that filtered back to Japanese naval headquarters carried a disturbing common thread. Multiple ship captains reported that American ships had maneuvered with precision before visual contact was established. American gunfire had been remarkably accurate considering the darkness and confusion. The Americans had displayed none of the hesitation or confusion that should characterize a force fighting blind in the dark. Japanese intelligence officers began compiling reports from survivors and analyzing captured American equipment from other engagements. Slowly, reluctantly, they reached a conclusion that fundamentally challenged Japanese naval doctrine. The Americans possessed detection equipment that worked in complete darkness, and they were using it effectively in combat. The technology the Japanese had dismissed as impractical or unimportant was changing the nature of naval warfare, and Japan was on the wrong side of that change. The realization didn't come all at once. Naval warfare is chaotic, and individual battles rarely provide clear lessons. Ships sink for many reasons: superior gunnery, lucky hits, tactical errors, mechanical failures. But as Japanese naval commanders compiled after-action reports from engagements throughout late 1942 and into 1943, patterns emerged that couldn't be explained by conventional factors. American ships were consistently detecting Japanese forces at ranges that exceeded visual capabilities, even on clear nights. American gunfire was achieving hits, in conditions where optical fire control should have been nearly impossible. American formations were maneuvering to counter Japanese movements before those movements should have been observable. The evidence pointed inexorably toward some form of electronic detection, but accepting that conclusion meant confronting an uncomfortable truth. Japan had fallen behind in a critical technology race. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay in November 1943 provided perhaps the clearest demonstration of radar's tactical impact. Rear Admiral Sentaro Omori led a Japanese force to bombard American positions on Bougainville. His cruisers and destroyers approached in darkness, confident in their ability to achieve surprise and deliver a devastating attack. Instead, they encountered an American force commanded by Rear Admiral Aaron Merrill, who had been tracking the Japanese ships by radar for over an hour. Merrill's cruisers opened fire at a range of approximately 10 miles, their radar-directed guns achieving hits before the Japanese even knew they were under attack. The engagement lasted less than an hour. The Japanese lost a light cruiser and a destroyer, with several other ships damaged. The Americans suffered only minor damage to a few ships. Omori withdrew without accomplishing his mission, his force having been intercepted and mauled by an enemy that had effectively ambushed him despite the darkness. The after-action report from that battle made sobering reading for Japanese naval planners. Omori's ships had been detected while still beyond visual range. American formations had positioned themselves perfectly for the engagement, suggesting they'd been tracking Japanese movements continuously. American gunfire had been accurate from the opening salvos, indicating some form of fire control assistance beyond optical range finding. The conclusion was inescapable. The Americans possessed a significant technological advantage that negated Japanese training and tactical expertise in night combat. Japanese intelligence efforts intensified. Captured American sailors were interrogated about their ship's equipment. Wreckage from downed American aircraft was examined for radar components. Japanese technical experts analyzed photographs and intelligence reports, trying to understand the capabilities and limitations of American radar systems. What they learned was both technically impressive and strategically alarming. American naval radar by late 1943 came in several types, each optimized for different functions. The SK air search radar could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles, providing warning of incoming air attacks long before visual or acoustic detection was possible. The SG surface search radar, which had so effectively tracked Japanese ships at Guadalcanal and Empress Augusta Bay, could detect large surface vessels at 20 to 30 miles in good conditions. Fire control radars like the Mark 8 could track individual targets and provide continuous range and bearing data to gun directors, allowing accurate fire even when the target was completely invisible to optical rangefinders. The technical sophistication of these systems exceeded Japanese capabilities by a substantial margin. American radar transmitters were more powerful, receivers were more sensitive, and the signal processing techniques were more advanced. American ships carried multiple radar sets, providing redundancy and allowing simultaneous air and surface search. The integration of radar with fire control systems meant that American ships could engage targets they detected electronically without ever acquiring them optically. For Japanese naval officers trained to believe that night combat prowess came from superior optics and better trained lookouts, this was a fundamental paradigm shift. The Americans weren't trying to see better in the dark. They were using invisible electromagnetic radiation to detect targets, regardless of visibility conditions. It was as if the Americans had developed a form of technological telepathy, knowing where Japanese ships were through means that human senses couldn't match. Japanese radar development programs received increased priority, but they faced severe obstacles. The industrial resources required to produce sophisticated radar sets in quantity were already stretched thin, supporting other critical programs. Japanese electronics manufacturing lagged behind American capabilities in precision components, particularly in the vacuum tubes that formed the heart of radar transmitters and receivers. Quality control issues meant that even when Japanese factories produced radar sets, they were often unreliable or had performance characteristics far below specifications. More fundamentally, integrating radar into existing doctrine and tactics proved difficult. Japanese naval training had spent years optimizing for optical warfare. Officers understood how to use binoculars and optical rangefinders. They knew how to interpret what they saw through those instruments and translate visual observations into tactical decisions. Radar required different skills. Reading a radar scope, interpreting returns, distinguishing real targets from false echoes caused by weather or sea conditions, these were entirely new competencies that the existing officer corps had never developed. The few Japanese ships that did receive radar installations often used them ineffectively or not at all. Crews didn't trust the equipment, preferring to rely on traditional optical methods they understood. Officers sometimes turned radar sets off to prevent electromagnetic emissions from revealing their position, not understanding that American radar could detect them whether Japanese radar was operating or not. The cultural and institutional barriers to effectively adopting new technology proved nearly as significant as the technical challenges of developing that technology in the first place. By mid-1943, Japanese naval strategy was struggling with a cruel reality. Night surface combat, which was supposed to be Japan's great equalizer against American numerical superiority, had become another arena where American technology provided decisive advantages. Japanese ships still possessed excellent torpedoes, well-trained crews, and aggressive tactical doctrine. But these advantages meant little when the Americans could detect Japanese forces, long before the Japanese detected them, position their ships optimally, and open fire with radar-directed guns while Japanese ships were still searching for targets optically. The strategic implications extended beyond individual battles. Japan's defensive perimeter across the Pacific depended partly on the assumption that American advances would be costly and slow, particularly in contested waters where Japanese forces could use night attacks to inflict disproportionate casualties. If American radar negated the effectiveness of those night attacks, then the entire defensive strategy became more precarious. American forces could advance more quickly, suffer fewer casualties, and maintain more aggressive operational tempos because they didn't have to fear Japanese night attacks to the same degree. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet, received briefings on radar's impact during the spring of 1943. Yamamoto was among the more technologically sophisticated Japanese flag officers, having spent time in the United States and understanding American industrial capabilities better than most of his peers. The radar reports confirmed his pessimistic assessment of Japan's long-term prospects. America's industrial and technological advantages were manifesting across multiple domains simultaneously. More ships, better aircraft, superior submarines, and now electronic detection capabilities that rendered traditional Japanese tactical advantages obsolete. Yamamoto would be killed in April 1943 when American fighters, having intercepted and decoded Japanese communications about his inspection tour, ambushed his aircraft over Bougainville. His death deprived Japan of one of its most capable naval strategists, but even Yamamoto's brilliance couldn't have solved the fundamental problem radar represented. Japan was fighting an attritional war against an enemy that was technologically advancing faster than Japan could keep pace. The night battles continued throughout 1943 and into 1944, but the pattern became increasingly one-sided. American radar improved continuously, with new models offering better range, resolution, and reliability. American crews became more proficient at using radar, integrating electronic detection with visual observation, and developing tactics that leveraged both. Japanese forces, meanwhile, continued fighting largely as they had in 1942, using tactics designed for an era before radar had changed the fundamental nature of naval warfare. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, in June 1944, demonstrated how completely the technological balance had shifted. Japanese carrier aircraft, attempting to attack American task forces, were detected by radar at extreme ranges. American fighters, directed by radar controllers, intercepted the Japanese formations far from the American fleet. The result was a slaughter that American pilots would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese naval aviation lost approximately 300 aircraft in a single day, casualties that Japanese training programs could never replace. While this was primarily an air battle, it illustrated the same principle that applied to surface combat. Radar gave the Americans awareness of the battle space that the Japanese simply couldn't match. American controllers knew where every formation was, could vector fighters to intercept threats, and could coordinate defensive operations with a precision that was impossible using visual observation alone. The Japanese, fighting without equivalent radar capabilities, were operating partially blind against an enemy who could see everything. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese attempts to counter American radar focused on several approaches, each reflecting different aspects of the problem. One approach was electronic, trying to detect American radar emissions and use them as warning of American ship locations. Japanese ships began carrying radar warning receivers that could detect American radar transmissions. In theory, this would provide Japanese forces with early warning that American ships were in the area and searching for targets. In practice, the tactic had limited effectiveness. American radar operated continuously, meaning that detecting radar emissions told you that American ships were somewhere in the area but didn't provide precise location information. More problematically, if you could detect American radar, the Americans had already detected you. The radar emissions were coming from a ship that had almost certainly already acquired a radar contact on the Japanese vessel. Knowing you'd been detected didn't help much if you couldn't see the enemy to return fire. Another approach was tactical, trying to close to ranges where Japanese visual advantages and superior torpedoes could overcome American radar benefits. Japanese doctrine increasingly emphasized high-speed approaches, attempting to close the distance before American radar-directed gunfire could inflict decisive damage. Destroyers would charge at maximum speed, hoping to get close enough to launch torpedoes. Some commanders attempted to use rain squalls and weather fronts as concealment, knowing that heavy rain could create false returns and clutter on radar scopes, potentially masking ship movements. These tactics occasionally achieved local successes. At the Battle of Vella Gulf in August 1943, Japanese destroyers attempting a high-speed run were annihilated by American destroyers that had positioned themselves perfectly using radar. At the Battle of Vella La Vella in October 1943, Japanese destroyers managed to engage American ships at close range and achieved some success, but only after accepting heavy losses during the approach. The pattern was consistent. Even when Japanese tactics worked, they worked at a cost that Japan couldn't sustain. The most ambitious Japanese response was attempting to develop their own advanced radar systems, but this effort was consistently frustrated by resource limitations and technical challenges. The Type 22 surface search radar, introduced in late 1943, represented Japan's most capable naval radar. It could theoretically detect large ships at 15 to 20 miles, roughly comparable to early American sets like the SG. But production numbers were limited, reliability was poor, and integration with fire control systems was minimal. Japanese fire control radar development lagged even further behind. While American ships by 1944 routinely used radar to direct gunfire against targets they couldn't see visually, Japanese ships were still primarily dependent on optical range-finding. Some Japanese cruisers and battleships received fire control radar sets, but crews often didn't trust them, preferring to rely on the optical systems they understood. The few occasions when Japanese ships did attempt radar-directed fire control, the results were mixed at best, reinforcing the skepticism about the technology's practical utility. The institutional resistance to radar within the Japanese Navy reflected broader cultural factors. The emphasis on fighting spirit and martial virtue made some officers uncomfortable with the idea that technology could replace human skill. Night combat training had been intensely difficult, separating elite units from average ones based on their mastery of demanding techniques. Radar seemed to make that training less relevant, which threatened the status and identity of officers who'd built their careers on excellence in traditional methods. There was an element of denial as well. Accepting that American radar provided decisive advantages meant accepting that Japanese forces were fighting at a fundamental disadvantage that courage and skill couldn't overcome. The most visceral demonstration of radar's capabilities came during the Battle of Cape St. George in November 1943. Captain Kyoto Kagawa commanded a force of 5 Japanese destroyers on a supply run to Japanese forces at Buka. It was the kind of mission Japanese destroyers had executed countless times. High-speed run under cover of darkness, deliver supplies and personnel, withdraw before dawn. Kagawa was an experienced destroyer commander who understood his ship's capabilities intimately and had every confidence in his crew's ability to operate effectively at night. American Captain Arleigh Burke, commanding Destroyer Squadron 23, had been tracking Kagawa's force by radar for over an hour. Burke's destroyers had detected the Japanese ships at a range of approximately 22 miles, far beyond any possibility of visual contact. Burke maneuvered his formation carefully, positioning his ships to intercept the Japanese destroyers as they completed their supply mission and began their return journey. The Americans achieved perfect tactical position, approaching from an angle that maximized their torpedo firing opportunities while minimizing Japanese ability to respond. At approximately 1:56 in the morning, Burke's destroyers launched torpedoes at a range of approximately 5,000 yards. The Japanese destroyers still hadn't detected the American force. The first indication Kagawa had that anything was wrong came when torpedoes began striking his ships. 3 Japanese destroyers were hit within minutes, massive explosions tearing through their hulls as torpedo warheads detonated. Kagawa's own ship managed to evade the initial torpedo spread, but now found itself under attack by an enemy force whose location he could barely determine. The surviving Japanese destroyers attempted to fight back, but they were engaging an enemy they couldn't see while that enemy tracked their every movement by radar. American destroyers maneuvered using radar contacts, maintaining optimal firing positions while avoiding Japanese return fire. The engagement was brief and brutally one-sided. 3 Japanese destroyers sank. The 2 survivors, including Kagawa's ship, withdrew at maximum speed, having never established effective fire control against the American force. Kagawa's after-action report made for disturbing reading at Combined Fleet Headquarters. His force had been detected, tracked, and ambushed by an enemy that had maintained complete awareness of Japanese movements, while the Japanese remained effectively blind. The Americans had achieved tactical surprise despite the fact that the engagement occurred in open ocean with no terrain for concealment. They'd done it purely through electronic detection capabilities that gave them what amounted to vision in absolute darkness. Similar incidents accumulated throughout late 1943 and 1944. At the Battle of Surigao Strait in October 1944, American battleships and cruisers, using radar fire control, devastated a Japanese force attempting a night attack. The Americans opened fire at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards, their radar-directed guns achieving hits, while the Japanese were still trying to locate targets visually. It was the last major battleship engagement in history, and it demonstrated conclusively that the era of optical fire control had ended. Radar-directed, gunfire was simply superior in every measurable way. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, commanding the Japanese force at Surigao Strait, never fully understood what was happening to his ships. His battleships and cruisers came under accurate, devastating fire from directions where he could see no enemy vessels. His formation disintegrated under the bombardment, ships burning and sinking before they could effectively return fire. Nishimura died when his flagship, the battleship Yamashiro, was overwhelmed by torpedo and gunfire hits. His last messages indicated confusion and frustration. His force was being destroyed by an enemy they couldn't locate, couldn't target, couldn't fight. The psychological impact of radar-enabled combat on Japanese naval personnel was profound and demoralizing. Sailors and officers had trained extensively for night combat, believing their preparation and equipment gave them decisive advantages. Now they found themselves fighting an enemy who seemed omniscient, who knew where Japanese ships were before the Japanese knew where American ships were, who could coordinate complex maneuvers in complete darkness, who could direct accurate gunfire at targets they'd never seen visually. It created a sense of helplessness that corroded morale and fighting effectiveness. Japanese crews began to dread night engagements, knowing they would likely be detected and engaged before they could effectively fight back. The aggressive confidence that had characterized Japanese night tactics in early war engagements gave way to caution and defensive mindsets. Officers who'd built reputations on their night combat prowess found their expertise rendered obsolete by technology they didn't fully understand and couldn't counter. Japanese technical intelligence made determined efforts to capture intact American radar equipment for detailed study. Several attempts were partially successful. Damaged American aircraft that crash-landed on Japanese-held islands sometimes had. Their radar sets recovered relatively intact. Submarine attacks occasionally resulted in American ships being abandoned with equipment left behind. In each case, Japanese engineers carefully dismantled and studied the captured radar systems, attempting to understand both their technical specifications and operational employment. What they discovered was both impressive and discouraging. American radar represented sophisticated engineering that utilized components and manufacturing techniques Japan struggled to replicate. The cavity magnetron, the core component of American microwave radar systems, required precision machining and exotic materials that Japanese industry couldn't produce in adequate quantities. The signal processing circuitry employed design approaches that Japanese radar engineers had explored but hadn't successfully implemented at scale. More significantly, the captured equipment revealed that American radar technology was still advancing. Later model radar sets showed improvements over earlier versions: better range, better resolution, better integration with fire control systems. Japan wasn't just behind in radar technology. The gap was widening. American industrial capacity allowed continuous refinement and improvement, with new radar models entering service regularly. Japanese industry, stretched thin, supporting multiple critical programs and suffering under increasing Allied bombing campaigns, couldn't keep pace. One captured piece of equipment that particularly impressed Japanese engineers was a Mark 8 fire control radar recovered from a damaged American cruiser. The system could track a moving target continuously, providing real-time range, bearing, and rate of change information directly to gun directors. It essentially automated much of the fire control process that Japanese ships still performed manually using optical rangefinders and mechanical calculators. The Mark 8 represented integration of electronics and fire control at a level Japanese systems hadn't approached. Engineers compiled detailed technical reports on the captured radar equipment, complete with photographs, circuit diagrams, and performance analyses. These reports circulated through Japanese naval technical bureaus and reached senior commanders. The conclusions were uniformly pessimistic. American radar technology was superior across every metric: range, accuracy, reliability, integration with weapons systems. Japan could theoretically develop equivalent systems, but doing so would require years of development time, massive resource allocation, and manufacturing capabilities that Japan increasingly lacked as the war progressed. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who became Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet in May 1944, reviewed the radar intelligence reports with growing concern. Toyoda understood that Japan's strategic situation was deteriorating rapidly. American forces were advancing across the Pacific, capturing island bases that brought them progressively closer to the Japanese homeland. Japanese merchant shipping was being decimated by American submarines, strangling the flow of raw materials Japan's industry desperately needed. And now, in surface combat, one of Japan's supposed advantages had been negated by American technology. Toyoda recognized that conventional naval engagements were becoming increasingly futile. American numerical superiority, combined with technological advantages like radar, made traditional fleet actions unwinnable. This realization contributed to the development of increasingly desperate tactics. If Japan couldn't win conventional engagements, perhaps unconventional methods might change the calculus. The kamikaze special attack units that emerged in late 1944 were partly a response to this strategic desperation. If trained pilots couldn't overcome American advantages through skill and tactics, Perhaps sacrificial attacks might achieve results that conventional methods couldn't. But even kamikaze tactics ran headlong into American radar capabilities. Radar provided early warning of incoming aircraft, allowing American combat air patrols to intercept kamikaze formations before they reached their targets. Radar-directed anti-aircraft fire created defensive barrages that destroyed many kamikaze aircraft before they could strike ships. The same technology that had revolutionized surface combat proved equally valuable in air defense. Japanese desperation tactics were being countered by American technology at every turn. By early 1945, the Japanese Navy had essentially ceased meaningful offensive operations. Fuel shortages, personnel losses, and the destruction of most major combatant ships limited what was possible operationally. But even if fuel and ships had been available, the radar disparity made conventional naval operations suicidal. American forces could detect Japanese ships at extreme ranges, track their movements continuously, and coordinate attacks using information that Japanese forces simply couldn't match. The final major naval operation, the Yamato's suicide mission toward Okinawa in April 1945, illustrated the complete collapse of Japanese naval effectiveness. The super battleship Yamato, along with a light cruiser and 8 destroyers, sortied from Japan on a one-way mission to beach at Okinawa and provide artillery support for Japanese ground forces. The ships carried only enough fuel for a one-way voyage, highlighting the desperate nature of the operation. American submarines detected the Japanese force shortly after it departed. American reconnaissance aircraft tracked its movements continuously. By the time Yamato approached Okinawa, American carrier task forces had positioned themselves perfectly to intercept. The subsequent air attacks sank Yamato, the cruiser, and 4 destroyers in a matter of hours. The Japanese force never came close to reaching Okinawa, never fired its massive guns at the intended targets, and accomplished nothing beyond adding to the casualty lists. Throughout this final mission, American forces maintained complete awareness of Japanese movements through multiple detection methods, including radar. The Japanese, meanwhile, had only fragmentary information about American force positions. They sailed into a carefully prepared ambush, detected and tracked continuously by an enemy whose technical capabilities they couldn't match. It was a fitting, tragic conclusion to a war where technological disparity had progressively overwhelmed Japanese tactical skill and fighting spirit. The strategic lesson of radar's impact extended far beyond the Pacific War. The technology demonstrated that information dominance could be as decisive as numerical superiority or firepower. A force that knew where enemy units were, how they were maneuvering, and what they were doing possessed enormous tactical advantages, even if nominally outnumbered or outgunned. Radar provided that information dominance, creating situational awareness that was impossible to achieve through traditional methods. Post-war, every major navy incorporated radar as fundamental equipment rather than optional technology. Modern warships carry multiple radar systems for different functions: air search, surface search, fire control, navigation, and aircraft control. The principle, established in World War II, that electronic detection provides capabilities human senses can't match, became foundational to naval warfare doctrine. No modern warship would be considered combat capable without sophisticated radar systems. The evolution continued beyond simple detection. Modern naval radar integrated with computer systems enables automatic tracking of hundreds of contacts simultaneously, threat assessment based on target behavior, and weapon system integration that automates engagement sequences. The Mark 8 fire control radar that impressed Japanese engineers in 1944 was primitive compared to modern phased array radar systems that can track ballistic missiles, direct surface-to-air weapons, and provide 3-dimensional battlefield awareness simultaneously. The principle extends beyond naval applications. Airborne radar enables aircraft to detect and engage targets beyond visual range. Ground-based radar provides air defense and battlefield surveillance. Satellite-mounted radar monitors entire continents, detecting changes and movements from orbit. Modern military operations at every level depend on radar and related electronic sensing technologies to a degree that would have seemed like science fiction to officers fighting in World War II. But the core lesson remains unchanged from those dark nights off Guadalcanal in 1942 when Admiral Abe discovered that American ships knew where he was before he knew where they were. Technology that provides better information about the battlespace confers decisive tactical advantages. Forces that possess superior sensors and can effectively utilize the information those sensors provide will consistently defeat opponents who rely on inferior detection methods, regardless of other factors like training, courage, or tactical doctrine. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, this lesson came too late to influence the war's outcome. Japanese recognition of radar's importance came years after American deployment of effective systems. Japanese attempts to develop equivalent capabilities were consistently frustrated by industrial limitations, resource shortages, and the technical challenges of catching up to an opponent whose technology continued advancing. By the time Japanese radar programs began producing capable equipment, Japan's strategic situation had deteriorated beyond the point where improved sensors could make meaningful difference. Individual Japanese naval officers and engineers understood what radar represented. The technical reports, after-action analyses, and intelligence assessments clearly documented both American capabilities and Japanese deficiencies. But understanding a problem and solving it are entirely different challenges. Understanding that American radar gave them decisive advantages didn't provide Japan with the industrial capacity, technical expertise, or time needed to close the gap. The captured radar equipment sitting in Japanese laboratories told a story of technological and industrial disparity that extended far beyond a single weapons system. The sophisticated components, the precision manufacturing, the continuous improvements visible in successive radar models, all reflected an industrial base that could support extensive research and development while simultaneously producing equipment in massive quantities. Japan's industry, stretched thin, supporting multiple military programs and suffering progressive damage from Allied bombing, simply couldn't match that capability. There's a particular cruelty in understanding exactly why you're losing, but lacking the means to change the outcome. Japanese naval officers reading intelligence reports about American radar capabilities understood perfectly that they were fighting at a fundamental disadvantage. They knew American ships could detect them first, track them continuously, and engage them effectively in conditions where Japanese forces were essentially blind. They knew their training in night combat tactics, once considered a decisive advantage, had been rendered largely obsolete by technology. But knowing all this didn't provide solutions. The radar gap was just one manifestation of broader disparities in industrial capacity, technological sophistication, and resource access. Japan couldn't magic into existence the manufacturing capabilities, electronic components, and technical expertise needed to match American radar systems. The gap existed because of fundamental differences in industrial development, research infrastructure, and economic capacity that had emerged over decades. The story of Japanese admirals confronting American radar capabilities is ultimately a story about technological warfare and its inexorable logic. Wars are fought with the industrial and technological capabilities nations possess when the fighting begins, not the capabilities they wish they had. Japan entered World War II with significant qualitative advantages in areas like night combat tactics and torpedo technology. But the war lasted long enough for American technological and industrial advantages to manifest in weapons systems like radar that negated Japanese tactical strengths. Admiral Abe, standing on Hiei's bridge in the darkness off Guadalcanal as American destroyers maneuvered with impossible precision, experienced the first shock of this realization. Other Japanese commanders would experience similar moments throughout the war. The confusion when enemy ships opened accurate fire in pitch darkness, the frustration when carefully planned night attacks were intercepted before reaching their targets, the growing understanding that the enemy possessed technological capabilities that Japanese forces couldn't counter. These weren't failures of courage or competence. Japanese naval personnel fought with skill and determination throughout the war. Their training was excellent, their tactics were sophisticated, and their equipment in many areas was world-class. But they were fighting an enemy whose technological advantages progressively overwhelmed traditional military virtues. Radar was one critical technology among many where American capabilities surpassed Japanese equivalents, and the cumulative effect of these technological disparities was decisive. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.